Greetings, Dan from Planet Earth here, and here I am, still on Planet Earth, but I'm about to look at a really big crater left on Earth. Will you come along? There is an Apollo test capsule. This was only used to test a splashdown when the capsule had to land. It never actually went to space. From 1963 to 1970, the Apollo astronauts trained at the Meteor Crater. The largest meteorite ever found was the Willamette meteorite from Oregon. Where is that? This is a good size reference. Look how big that is. What? 10 seconds until impact. And this kid was covered in concrete when he was selling the newspapers. Poor kid.
Hurricane force winds threw 175 million tons of material in all directions. The shock of impact melted most of the meteor and spread it with the large plume of debris. It took just 10 seconds and Meteor Crater was formed.
This is a piece of the meteorite that was actually found in the crater. I am now touching something that is billions of years old. Captain's log. I've just beamed into this very strange crater on this planet.
The assumption was it was the size of the bottom of the crater, so they started right in the middle, thinking any second they're going to hit this big chunk of metal and then start digging it up. Of course, it doesn't work that way. They do dig and drill holes out here for 25 years looking for the meteor before finally shutting it down along with the stock market crash. They finally give up on the mining operation by 1929, and by the 1950s the government has an amazing new technology called ground penetrating radar, and the government scientists in the Army were actually studying bomb craters in Nevada, and they built all the equipment. It was big and heavy, so they built it into a big bomber airplane, and they were studying the bomb craters from the air in Nevada, and they said, well, why don't we fly over and take a look at Meteor Crater with our new equipment? And they thought, of course, they'd see some sort of big meteor hiding under the ground somewhere. It's iron nickel meteorite, it's metal, so it should show up really well on their radar. And they flew back and forth over the crater, and they said it looks like there's nothing at all in the crater. But they noticed when they flew across the desert, the surface of the desert was completely covered in metal. So when a meteor hits it, blows up like a bomb, all that energy's going down, but it gets channeled around and up and out and back out onto the surface of the desert. So today, around the crater for miles in every direction, there's billions of little fine particles of meteorite mixed in with the sand and debris and all that. So, but with modern equipment, we can see there is actually meteorite under the crater. There's little tiny particles that are on the surface of the desert. Same particles are actually 1,000 to 3,000 feet beneath the bottom of the crater, and they couldn't see that back in the 50s. Their equipment just wasn't that sensitive at that time, or that they couldn't go that far down. Okay, so before we start the trail, most important thing, of course, is safety. So please, nobody step off the trail into the loose rocks on the side of the trail. And we do have to stay as a group, so I'm going to get up front and we can go ahead and get started. Next spot is the best place for a pano, and when we get out to the end, I'll take photos for everybody. So we'll take all those photos out of the end. In the end, though, this is a small crater. It's about a mile in diameter. The important thing about our crater, it's really just in very good condition. And that's because the meteor landed in the high desert. It's just a really ideal place to store a crater long term. So today, it's basically the one on the planet that's not full of dirt or full of water or full of vegetation. So scientists come from all over the world to study this crater. It's also, I like to say it's the most accessible crater on the planet because the meteor conveniently landed between 2 national parks and 6 miles from the interstate. So it's a good location to come up and look at a crater. So a terrible tour guide joke. The first time the government knew the crater was here, 1870, the Army was commissioned to go out west to basically just map their way across the west, find a nice straight shot to put in a railroad so they can connect the east and the west coast. As they're passing through, they see this from a distance. It's way out of the way, but it's still within the range they needed to map. So they send an Army scout up here. His name was Franklin Benito. Benitez. He comes up, rides up on a horse, takes a look at the crater, reports back to the Army, tells the Army map makers that he found a big hole. While the map makers try to get more information out of him, Franklin, apparently a man of few words, and when they say, "Can you tell us more about it?" He says something like, "Really big hole." And so they actually named the crater Franklin's Hole as a joke. We think the problem was probably they found all these volcanoes, and so they immediately assumed it was a volcano, but they had probably already run out of names, so they just named it after the guy that found it, really as a joke. As far as we can tell. But the crater is really forgotten about. It's put on a map and forgotten about. But when they're building the railroad through the area in the 1880s, people keep finding all the meteorite, and they're selling the meteorite at the railroad trading depot. And the guy at the railroad trading depot sells a box of meteorite to the U.S. Geological Survey. And then in 1891, a team of geologists from the USGS come out to study the crater, and one of the lead geologists goes back to Washington, D.C. and tells the head of the USGS, Grove Carl Gilbert, at the time in 1891, they tell him basically this is possibly a meteor impact crater, and he's not really sure. So Gilbert really doesn't believe that there's any impact craters on planet Earth. The assumption was at that time that all meteorite burns up in the atmosphere, because that's what they see every night when they're looking at the sky, looking through their telescopes. So he decides to come out and take a look at the crater for himself, which was a considerable effort at the time. He basically gets on a train in Washington, D.C. and takes a train in 1891 over 2,000 miles across the country. And they stop the train for him over here, and he's got horses waiting for him, rides up to take a look at the crater. He's here for about a day and a half, and goes back on the train, and then rides all the way back to Washington, D.C., and he writes a report about the crater saying that he believed this was a volcanic steam vent, that it was not an impact crater. He said all the meteorite on the rim of the crater was merely incidental. He said that he thought a meteor blew up in the air and just rained all the meteorite down onto the, what was already a volcano. And so now the crater is listed by the government as a volcano. It is just government land. It's the frontier, really, or the Arizona territories at that time. What happens is Daniel Barringer, a mining engineer from Pennsylvania, in 1902, he gets a chunk of the meteorite, and he has a silver mine south of Tucson, and he sends it off to a lab and has it tested, and the sample comes back. It's mostly iron and nickel, but it contains gold and platinum and silver and diamonds and all these really valuable trace elements. So he gets the mining rights for the crater, sends a team of workers up here and has them start digging. Within a week or two, he gets up here himself to take a look at it, actually for the first time after he got the mining rights. And he was amazed by the crater and starts to study the crater. He maps everything, he does core samples, and he does really, really good science out here. Within a couple of years, he wrote a paper in 1908 that basically proved this was a meteor impact crater. But the government doesn't officially recognize this as a meteor impact crater, believe it or not, until 1968. But what happens basically, he mines, he digs, drills holes all over, studies the crater, and by 1929, he's never made a profit, even though most geologists, or more and more geologists, are agreeing that it is an impact crater. But the stock market crashes, he shuts everything down, and returns to his home in Pennsylvania. And when he gets back home about a week later, the stock market crashes about a week after that, the owner of the crater, Daniel Barringer, unexpectedly passes away. But he had 8 adult children. One of his sons was a geologist, and they did want to preserve the crater and protect it, but they all lived basically in the main line of Philadelphia, the very comfortable and affluent suburbs, and no one really was interested in packing up their families and coming out and living on the rim of the crater back in the 1930s. So after a couple of years, they decided to work out a deal with the ranch, and everything was fine for a year or two, but then the government built Route 66 right past the crater, right through the ranch, and now people are trying to drive up here to take a look at the crater because it was in books and magazines and postcards and things like that. The problem is there was no road between here and old Route 66, and so now people are just, they're driving their old 1930s era vehicles right on down Route 66, and then they're turning into the desert and trying to drive 5 to 6 miles across the surface of the desert in their 1930s era vehicles. So of course they're breaking down and they're getting stuck, and now the ranchers, they have cowboys out there with mules, and their only job was just to drag vehicles back to Route 66 who got stuck in the desert. So of course it's a mess for the ranch, and at first they try to chase people off, but that doesn't work at all, and they decide basically to do the American thing, and they decide to start charging admission. So they figure that they'll go ahead and just build their own road back to Route 66, and then just charge. At first, they thought maybe a nickel or a dime or something, but once they built the almost 6-mile road all the way back to Route 66, they actually started to charge 50 cents to come up and look at the crater because they had to build and maintain that really big road. And that, of course, is Meteor Crater Road today. So. Oh, that is the wing of an airplane. I'll tell you about that. We do have some of our samples down there, maybe every year, the other year, maybe about a chop bag.
You can still see there's old mining equipment. Ah, cool. Drilling out in the Old West, finding an old crater.
It actually was completed around 1908, 1909. Earliest photo we have is of 1909. And then by the 50s, one of the cowboys actually burns the building down, unfortunately. So the roof of the building burned off, and then the top has been kind of slowly caving in. We have a photo of the building it was about this high back in 1961. We know that because the astronauts trained here, and they were standing in front of the building, and they took a photo, and they just hiked out of the crater, and they're drinking from their canteens, actually, kind of leaning against the wall of the building. So we know all the remaining damage has just been done from 1961. They also built a cave back here. You might have noticed the cave when you were coming around the corner. That's because they worked all summer, and they worked right through what's called monsoon season. It's our rainy season in this area. And we're 15 stories up, 18 stories at the top of the hill, and the crater's covered with iron nickel meteorite. So we're basically standing on an enormous lightning rod, 15 stories above the plane. So what happens is the storms come in, and they're on top of us within minutes. Yeah, we get some absolutely amazing light shows up here during those lightning storms. Of course, we're all the way over to the other side here where it's safer, but our building gets hit by lightning sometimes 20 or 30 times a year. So basically, I don't know if you noticed the shiny thing down there. Well, the crater really is a no-fly zone. And back in 1964, this pilot decides to fly into the crater to try to take a photo. Really bad decision, obviously, since he crashed, but it was a pilot and a co-pilot in a Cessna 150, which is a tiny airplane with a little motor, and they stopped in Winslow and filled the plane with fuel, which is only about 10 miles away by air. And when they get over the crater, when they dip into the rim of the crater, they dip below what's called an inversion layer. The air tends to roll in the crater during the day, and so once it gets under that inversion layer, the plane just starts to fall, and they decide to try to double back and try to speed up, maybe get a little momentum to get themselves out of the crater. But when they do that, the plane stalls. They head for the bottom and crash. Based on eyewitness accounts, they do crash right between two groups of guests. So they crash right between two families that were in the crater. And the families, I understand, run over and help pull the pilot and the co-pilot out of the burning airplane. So that's an amazing story. I got that story from the son of Captain Kidd, who's been out here at least 3 times in the last 4 or 5 years to visit the crater with his family. They still live in Phoenix. Captain Kidd lived in Phoenix, and the family still lives down there. So they do family trips up here every couple of years to the crater, and they love taking the tours. So, and we find out later in 1994, the pilot decides to do an interview with a newspaper, and in the interview he said that he was out of work for about a year, but he was able to recover and finally return to his day job. He was a commercial airline pilot with one of the big airlines, yeah, so I'll let you process that for a second before I move on. But he said that the reason he agreed to do the interview with the newspaper is he said he had a perfect safety record for the next 30 years, and that's why he agreed to do the interview, so everyone would know, because people keep asking him about it. He was famous as pilots mostly because he's the pilot that crashed into the Meteor Crater. So, yeah, he said he had a perfect safety record and retired and all that stuff finally in 1994.
This is where they kept that good old TNT in that mine. Still looks pretty good. Some remnants of old bygone era, probably the old tour centre. This is the old house. An old kettle. That is pretty awesome. Just imagine the sheer power of space breaking through our very tender atmosphere and striking us right down like that. And it was only 150 feet in diameter. That was the asteroid size. And it created a mile in diameter crater that could wipe out an entire city just for 150 feet of rock and iron. That's what it did. Isn't that amazing? Space is dangerous, and it's coming for us. It's coming for us all.
But either way, so thanks for being such a great group, and safe driving the rest of the way, and thanks for taking the tour.
Right down there you can still see the winch and the boiler that was used for the original dig site. So it would have come in from there. And then all the debris flying everywhere. Can you imagine the power of that? Just walking down to the lower observation deck. Which one shall I choose? So here I am on Moon Mountain, the very top of the crater. So that was a really cool tour, and I really suggest you come by if you're on Route 66 in Winslow, Arizona. Come by the Meteor Crater right here. It's amazing. It's pretty epic and a really good tour. The tour is added to the value of the ticket. You don't have to take it, but it's an optional thing. The guide was really informative and it was really great. It's about an hour tour. You get to walk around the perimeter because you can't do that without taking the tour. So if you want to see any more adventures I do, please click subscribe and click the tick if you liked it. That's me signing off. See you later.